In Jujutsu Kaisen 0, Yuta Okkutsu is a deeply insecure and isolated young man, tormented by the curse of Rika, his childhood friend who tragically died and was transformed into a cursed spirit that both protected him and harmed anyone who dared to get close to Yuta. When Satoru Gojo takes him to the Jujutsu Academy, he needs to learn how to control his curse to his advantage. But his greatest difficulty ends up being something else: learning to relate and connect more intimately with other people. In this case, the other fellow sorcerers at the school. This happens because after Rika's curse, Yuta ends up closing himself off from the world and consequently from other people, isolating himself from the possibility of hurting them. But this ends up creating something in Yuta that he himself didn't imagine. In a way, Yuta ends up having this duality between appearing to be that kind boy and student who always strives to be good, always do good and always be helpful to his friends, Maki, Togi and Panda, but at the same time, he carries Rika within him. And consequently, he also carries with a personality that he doesn't seem to be so aware of. Ultimately, after the school is attacked by Suguru Geto, seeing his friends lying on the ground forces Yuta to act in a way he never had acted before, with a new attitude and a new determination. He learns to use his negative side, Rika's side, to his advantage. In Jungian psychology, this would mean learning to use one's shadow, those negative, dark, and shadowy aspects of the personality that we normally tend to hide and never show into the light of the day. A side we feel ashamed of or even fear will be punished after we reveal it. But, as another author, Friedrich Nietzsche, who greatly inspired Jung, said in his posthumous fragments, it is a myth to believe that we will find our authentic self after leaving behind or forgetting one thing or another. To make ourselves, to mold a form from various elements. That is the task of a sculptor, of a productive human being. We can understand this more clearly looking at Yuta's personality type, in which, according to Personality Database, Yuta is considered an INFJ, a personality type with the functions an I, FE, TI, and SE. That is, while the introverted intuition NI seeks integrity, an ideal of perfection, for Yuta in this case it probably is linked to the ideal of what he considers good, in this case of being a good person. And instead of expressing this outwardly to and with other people with extroverted feeling FE, Yuta seems to be in a loop for much of the anime. That is, he skips the extroverted function and goes straight to the tertiary function, the TI, introverted thinking. For INFJs, this function is closely linked to creating a persona, a sense of esteem, an internal and sometimes concrete way of being. This is what makes the INFJ stop seeking external information, and that is outside of themselves, to begin or to have certainties that somehow arise from the voices in their heads, the introverted thinking, or else simply never putting themselves out there into experience and realizing how these voices are often wrong. A good example of this will be Adolf Hitler himself, who apparently was also an INFJ. He was so certain that the Jews were the reason for everything bad in the world and in Germany, as he put it in his speeches and also in his book, that he apparently forgot to test those ideas, those internal thoughts, this internal thinking into reality. In Yuta's case, this happens when he becomes shy about exposing himself and forming bonds with people. He shrinks from creating relationships. He prevents himself from forming bonds with others and from perceiving the reality around him. In other words, he stops using those extroverted functions of FE, which have to do with taking other people, their feelings, and their social cues into consideration, but also the SE, the extroverted sensation type, which is simply about putting oneself out there, in the real world, in the physical world, the world of sensations, outside of one's own head, something we already saw in the analysis of Suguru Geto. And this is an important function for this type for another reason. When we look at the brain, the relationship with what sometimes gives us a sense of personality, a sense of inhibition, of not exposing ourselves impulsively, of staying inside our heads, tends to be the prefrontal cortex region. A region in which, especially for men, has a strong relationship with serotonin levels. While dopamine, which is quite famous, is linked to expectations, learning, and plasticity. That is, whenever you need to change something, dopamine will help you with that. Serotonin, on the other hand, is more linked to the opposite, to stability, to what has already been learned, to consolidating a sense of comfort and reducing impulsivity. Both this region of the brain and this neurotransmitter, serotonin, ends up creating a notion of ego, both in the sense of Eastern religions and philosophies and in psychoanalysis itself. The ego is that feeling of myself. It is the I, the person you are in the present moment. The problem, then, is that this ego ends up being based only on what has already been learned in the past and not what the person can learn in the future. The famous story of Phineas Gage tells precisely this, of a guy who, after suffering an accident and having an iron bar destroy a large part of his prefrontal cortex, ended up completely losing his ability to inhibit himself, to control his emotions, becoming completely impulsive, doing whatever he felt like. In the end, he completely changed or even lost his personality. And that's exactly what this region of the brain and this neurotransmitter create, a personality, a well-defined ego. But as I say, the problem then is that this created ego, whether psychologically or neurologically, always ends up being based on what has already been learned in the past and not what the person can learn in the future. Therefore, I would even relate this view of TI, introverted thinking, to this function that creates a sense of self, or in this case, an ego. For Yuta, this ego would be about being a good person, someone who doesn't harm anyone, but who consequently always lives isolated from people, and even without realizing it, ends up hurting and harming people indirectly. Because there are big differences between not doing bad things and doing good things. While Yuta always tried to not to do evil, not to do things that would harm others, doing that doesn't mean that he was, through that, doing good things for other people, things that would help them in this case. In fact, it is something that he learned only after he opened up to his friends, to his relationships, especially in a time of need. And with that, he is not only able to use all of his powers in the best possible way, but he ends up discovering something that he himself had repressed for so long, perhaps so as not to think of himself as a bad person. One of the reasons for his own curse, Rika's curse, is because Yuta himself had said that he would marry her in the future. A promise that Yuta kept so that Rika wouldn't leave him at that moment, and so he probably wouldn't feel bad about that, or even think that he would be, in this case, the cause of her death. But because of this, he ends up being responsible for not letting her go to the world of the dead, and then he completely forgets and ignores this information. This is what psychoanalysts even call repression. When a person has an information they don't like to know, and because of that ends up hiding it from themselves so that they don't suffer from the conflict of knowing it and destroy their ego, the concept they previously had of themselves. Something that, however bizarre it may seem, is quite common, especially with people who have suffered from some kind of trauma. But in the end, Yuta manages to achieve individuation. He manages to break free from this loop of introversion. He opens up to his friend. He opens up to physical reality and finds not weakness, but strength in all of this. And that's it. That was the analysis of Yuta Okkutsu. If you have a suggestion for a character or anime series, write in the comments below and we'll see you in the next time. Goodbye.